Oh, there you go.
There you go. Thank you. So as mentioned, my name is Nick McDonald. I'm a registered professional planner, and I'm very happy to be here tonight to talk to you about floodplain mapping and policy. My role really is to make sure that we all have a common understanding of the policies that we have to implement as a planning authority, the planning authority being the district of Muskoka, and where we got the information from to do that, and what the impacts are collectively on people within the district. So some of this presentation might be a little technical, and I apologize in advance, but floodplain mapping is a very technical topic. And lots has been written about this item by the folks that have been hired by the district to do the work. So I'm going to try to unpack that as best as I can so that there is that common understanding. So in terms of what I'm doing tonight, I'm going to be providing a bit of a refresher on what the district has done in response to flooding events, and there have been a number, recent as this year. I'll provide an overview of the requirements of the province when it comes to flooding hazards, and you'll hear that we are required to do certain things. I'll be reviewing the work completed by the district on understanding where the flooding hazards are. That's the mapping piece. I'll review how the public can access this information, and Graham is going to take you through that. It'll be very instructive on thinking. I will be reviewing the initial floodplain policy approach that was presented to council at the public meeting. I'll review the comments that were made in support and in opposition to those policies when they were presented. And then I'll present some of the minor changes we're proposing to that policy approach in response to those comments and why, and then talk a little bit about what we think or what are the next steps. In terms of how we got here, the Muskoka Watershed Advisory Group was announced in August of 2019, and that was after the 100-year flood that happened that spring. I should note that it wasn't only the district of Muskoka that experienced that significant flood in that year. A number of other municipalities also did, and up to 23 or about 23 of those declared states of emergencies across 10 different watersheds. So this wasn't a district flooding issue, it was a significant Ontario-wide issue. The 2020 report prepared by this group concluded that the watershed is changing, and I think a lot of people see them, through change patterns of weather, change patterns of precipitation, increased incidences of flooding in major storms, and increased erosion and siltation. In other words, changes are happening in the watershed, and we are all noticing those changes. The report also made a number of recommendations, and I'm only going to go through a few of them, the ones that are that have an impact on what we're doing. Firstly, to implement integrated watershed management in the watershed, and that is to establish evidence-based approaches to interconnected issues affecting the watershed. In other words, instead of looking at each lake individually and how it operates and works, is to look at all the lakes and rivers in the watershed as a system, and a system that is connected with each other. Secondly, to review models for watershed scale governance, and that is to ensure the policies and decision-making processes and outcomes are consistent across the watershed. To a large extent, that's why we're here tonight, to talk about creating policies that are consistently applied across the watershed, so you know what the rules are in Lake Bay, but the same rules that they are in Township of Muskoka Lakes. Another part of the work completed at the time, or the recommendations made at the time, was to carry out a land use policy review across the watershed, to look at how each area municipality establishes policies and rules about how development happens within and adjacent to shoreline areas, and there are quite a few differences in approaches and how the rules work. So that was all documented. Undertake a set of flood mitigation projects and a review of the drawdown triggers in the province's Muskoka River Water Management Plan, and that is to understand the root causes of flooding and to develop flood mitigation strategies. And I'll come back to that because a considerable amount of work was done on that item. Another recommendation was to expand floodplain mapping to include critical areas of the watershed, and that has been done as well. And of course, all of this was supported by the Ontario 2020 flooding strategy, which basically said, do your best to protect people and property from natural hazards. In terms of the 3 integrated watershed management projects I want to talk about, I'll firstly state that in April of 2021, the province announced an initial investment of about $4 million to fund 13 projects. I'll talk about 3, several of which were focused on options to address or mitigate flooding impacts. Now, the 3 projects I'm going to talk about are found on the district's website. There are also outlines and summaries of those projects also on the district's website as well. And in some cases, there are also videos that explain and walk through the work that was done by the consultants at the time. So the 3 studies I'll talk about, the first one is the Water Management Plan Review Scoping Study. So that's the water management plan that was prepared by the Ministry of Natural Resources, and everyone in this room has probably heard about it. Maybe a little unhappy with it, want to know a little bit more about it. That was done by the Ministry of Natural Resources in 2006. And this study outlined the scope of a potential review of that plan and what it would entail. So the study concluded that an update could potentially review criteria for lake drawdown decisions and utilizing the lower range of normal operating zone for Lake Muskoka. We've all heard a lot about how the dam systems control water levels on Lake Muskoka, and it be done differently. The lake be drawn down even more to prevent spring flooding and so on. So those are all questions that folks have, and this study looked at that particular issue and indicated that if that management plan was actually going to be reviewed, that it would be a major amendment in accordance with the policies and practices of the government, and require a lot of supporting studies and the participation of all parties like the dam companies, hydro, the area municipalities, and so on. And I would note that over the last few years, the district has been very consistently asking the province to do just that, is to update the plan and update the plan quickly. They've asked the province to come and explain their ideas and the plan to district council, to hold a public forum. They've asked all kinds of questions, and all we've got back is crickets in terms of that actually happening or anything being done to update that plan. So we're kind of stuck with the plan we have, but we've been consistently asking for that plan to be updated. And in the last session, I mentioned to a few people, talk to your MPP, talk to them, let them know what you think about that plan going forward. So we've done what we can in terms of trying to get the province to move forward. The second study I'll talk about is the operational adjustment study. This one's quite technical. And again, it reviewed the management plan to see if there could be any operational adjustments made to reduce and help reduce the extent and impacts of flooding. So again, a very technical study. And it was concluded in that study that the lakes do not have enough storage capacity on their own in high flow events, and utilizing the full available drawdown in the spring may provide more storage during the spring freshet. However, if this occurred in 2013 and 2019, the water surface levels would only have been reduced by between 5 and 10 centimeters. And to put that in perspective, Lake Muskoka actually rose by 159 centimeters during that flood. So the impact of making that change is thought to be quite minimal. The third and last project that I'll talk about, and again, all these studies are online. They're quite technical and detailed, and there's a lot there to sink your teeth into. The third one is the Structural Flood Mitigation Options and Flood Modifications Review, which is a mouthful. But that study reviewed 10 flood mitigation options in the watershed in areas that were significantly impacted by flooding. And they looked at ways that the flooding could be reduced in those areas, and the total cost of doing that from a capital perspective was estimated to be about $200 million. But the conclusion that I got out of it, and others have as well, is that while there may be localized improvements to how flooding occurs, it wouldn't change the overall flooding impacts on a watershed-wide basis. And then even if there was a decision to perhaps implement some of those projects, where does the money come from, and so on. And I would note that one of the main recommendations of that study was to do a cost benefits analysis to actually figure out which of these actually make sense and should be completed. All of this is to say that lots of work is being done by the district to try to understand how flooding happens in the district And that's even before we get to doing the mapping. And all of these studies are online to demonstrate the district has done what it can. What these studies do indicate is that while some things may improve in some areas, there isn't much we can do about Mother Nature. I guess that's the bottom line. And yes, changes may occur if the province decides to review the management plan. Fair enough, but we have no idea when that's going to happen, how long it's going to take, who's going to fund it, and what the outcomes are. And that could be never or forever. At least we just don't know. So with all of that being said, flooding is still expected to occur, and there is and continues to be a municipal responsibility to direct development away from floodplains to protect public health and safety. So in terms of roles and responsibility in that regard, the province of Ontario, as mentioned, is responsible for the Muskoka River Watershed Management Plan. I've already talked about that. The second thing the province does is they also issue policy statements, and the one we're dealing with now is called the Provincial Planning Statement, and it came out in October of 2024. And that statement I'll talk about in a few minutes requires planning authorities like the District of Muskoka and the area municipalities to do certain things to implement and protect provincial interests. I'll talk about that in a moment. In terms of what the District of Muskoka does, firstly, flooding issues are a big deal. And in many parts of Ontario, flooding issues are looked after by a conservation authority. And a conservation authorities were created after Hurricane Hazel or as a result of Hurricane Hazel way back in the 50s. And many watersheds in Ontario have a conservation authority. And what these conservation authorities do is they manage risk within flooding hazard areas. Essentially, they have a whole team of people that are all qualified to review applications, prepare mapping, look at where the hazards are, and then there's a whole process around what they do that involves the submission of permits, fees, making decisions. If you don't like their decision, you can go to a tribunal and you can argue the decision in front of a tribunal and so on. And it's quite an involved process. And it would be nice, quite frankly, if there was a conservation authority in the district, but there is not such a conservation authority. And I don't think there's any desire to initiate one. And in fact, the province is trying to find conservation authorities back in other parts of Ontario. Anyways, in the absence of there being a conservation authority, it falls on the district and districts to figure out how to manage risk within these floodplain areas. And that's really a lot of what the policies are designed to do, is manage that risk. So in order to understand how to do that, the district has to complete floodplain mapping, which I'll talk about in a moment. It has to include flood hazard policies in the official plan, which I'll also be talking about. And all of this is designed to implement provincial planning direction related to flood hazard. So I'm going to talk a little bit about provincial requirements because the District of Muskoka is a creature of the municipality, and we are required to do certain things in the carrying out of our role as a municipality. So I'll start with the Planning Act. I'm not going to talk too much about the Act, but it is the piece of legislation that provides the basis for any planning decision that's made in the province. And it does two things. Firstly, it says that all decisions made by a council, and that's all decisions relating to a planning matter, shall be consistent with the provincial planning statement. Secondly, it indicates that when official plans are revised, like we are doing right now, we have to ensure that whatever we do is consistent with that provincial planning statement as well. So that's the hammer that they use to ensure that we do what we're required to do. With respect to the planning statement itself, we call it the provincial policy statement. So somebody who may know what is that. They changed the policies for planning in 2024, came into effect in October 2024 as a whole. And while the PPS has to be read as a whole, there are two types of policies in PPS. The first type of policy goes with a shall. So whenever shall is used in relation to a policy, it means the policy is a directive, limitation, or a prohibition. In other words, it's mandatory for us to implement that policy. Secondly, when should, promote, encourage, may, those are all wiggle words. I use them all the time. The policy is intended to be enabling or supportive, meaning that there is some discretion in interpretation. And I mention that because the policies I will go through in a minute use those words, and we have to take those words into account when we write our policy. So, in summary form, there is a section in the provincial planning statement that deals with natural hazards, and I'll go through some of those sections quickly. So the first one, 511, all development shall be directed away, notice the word shall, from areas of natural hazards where there's an unacceptable risk of public health or safety or property damage. So this section says all development shall be directed away. Well, there's a bit of discretion added in by saying there's an unacceptable risk to public health or safety, so there might be an acceptable risk. So that's what it says. Secondly, planning authorities shall identify hazardous lands and manage development in these areas. And one of the things, one of the ways of doing that, of course, is preparing floodplain mapping. Thirdly, 5C2A and B, all development shall generally be directed, so a new word is introduced, generally, to areas outside of hazardous lands adjacent to the shorelines of Georgian Bay, Lake Muskoka, and other lakes that are part of a river stream or small inland system. So we've got generally in there, but we're still shall. And then the next one is development inside all areas shall not be permitted. So there's no wiggle room there within areas that will be rendered inaccessible to people and vehicles during times of flooding unless, so that's where the discretion comes in, it has been demonstrated that the site is safe access, appropriate for the nature of the development and hazard. So the next one is 523D. Development inside all areas shall not be permitted within a floodway, regardless of whether the area of inundation contains high points of land not subject to flooding. And I'll talk about what a floodway is, but a floodway is around most of the lakes in the district and along most of the rivers in the district. And this policy is very clear. There's no wiggle room. There is no discretion. It shall not be permitted. Next, notwithstanding the policy above, development may be permitted in certain circumstances where a special policy area has been approved. A special policy area is approved by the province and has been typically applied to the downtown areas of small towns in flooding areas like Cambridge, Wilton, Brampton, where the town was there long before there were any policies on flooding, and it would be not appropriate to apply the full weight of the policies in those areas, and variances are made the consequence. But all of that needs a special study, and the province has to approve it. The other exception is the development is limited to uses which by their nature must locate within the floodway. And of course, a boat house is a great example of that. And that is the use that has to be in the floodway, much like a marina. Next one, where the two-zone concept is applied, development may be permitted within the flood fringe, subject to floodproofing and other criteria. And some of you in the room may know what one zone and two zone means, but along some of the rivers in the district, the river itself, and sort of the floodplain itself, is being divided into two pieces. The floodway portion is the part where the risk is the highest, and the flood fringe portion is on the edges where the flood risk is less. I'll talk about that, and we have a graphic on that to show you. And then lastly, on Georgian Bay and Lake Muskoka, which are treated differently, development may be permitted in those portions of hazardous lands where the effects and risk of public safety and environment could be mitigated and where specific criteria are demonstrated and achieved. So different rules apply to Lake Muskoka and Georgian Bay. So that's a lot to consider, but that's what we have to consider as planners, making recommendations to council on what policies they should be including in their official plan. So the effect of all of this is that out of the first principle, all development should be directed away from hazardous lands. And that's the precautionary approach that is in the provincial planning statement and what we're required to adopt here in the district. With respect to Georgian Bay and Lake Muskoka, development may be considered in those areas subject to meeting specific criteria, and it is to recognize that both Georgian Bay and Lake Muskoka function differently during flooding events. They're larger, even though Lake Muskoka is not that much larger than Lake Georgian, Lake Rosso, but it is over 100 square kilometers, so therefore it's considered to be a large inland lake. Thirdly, development within a floodway on a river where the two-zone approach has been applied is prohibited. So in the part of the river where the risk is the highest, no, we can't develop in that area, we can develop in the floodway. That's the fourth point, you can do things in the floodway. And then lastly, development within the floodway of all lakes except Georgian Bay Lake, SOPA is prohibited as per the policy I just went through. So, terminology. I'm pretty sure most people in this room understand as you're here, but it is very complicated. It's even complicated for planners to understand and consider when they're doing their own work. So one of the terms we use is flood elevation. And flood elevation is basically a measurement of above sea level, meters above sea level. That is measured, and that is the maximum distance from a river or a lake that flooding is expected to occur in a worst case scenario based on the analysis that is being completed. Other terminology is used as well. The terminology we use on the district line is static flood line. Static flood elevation means the same thing as flood elevation. In terms of what a floodplain is, that is the land that may be covered by water during flooding event. And of course, they're naturally occurring, and they're next to rivers and lakes, and they temporarily store excess water during storms and during freshet. So the floodplain is usually an area that is greater than where the water is typically flowing, usually higher or further inland when those things are happening. In terms of one zone and two zone, a one zone circumstance means that everything between that elevation on both sides is within the floodway, and that's what the one zone is on lakes and on some rivers. And the two zone approach applies, as I mentioned, to a circumstance where the river is being divided or the floodplain divided into two pieces. The part that where the risk is the highest, that's within the floodway, and in the area where the risk is less, the flooding could occur, and that's the floodplain. So in terms of the mapping, and to know where the PPS policies are to be applied, work on the updated mapping was initiated in 2018 and was completed by a professional engineering firm following current federal and provincial guidelines. All of this mapping is available online, and Graham in a few minutes will explain how to access that mapping and how to use that mapping going forward. And I'm very impressed, and I hope you are as well, in terms of the work that's being done by the district. But in terms of the mapping itself, there were a number of inputs. They are on this slide. They completed a hydraulic analysis of how water flows through the watershed, which included analysis of historic flood events, reviewed historic precipitation patterns and lake inflows and outflows. They did some hydraulic modeling to model flood elevations using contemporary computer modeling software. They reviewed older flood damage reduction program mapping from the 80s and 90s, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They did some field surveys, and they also did some underwater depth surveys in some areas to improve the accuracy of the mapping. As I mentioned, all of this is documented on the district's website, and you can go through it. It's quite technical and quite dry, it's quite hard to understand, but they did the work to figure out where the elevations are across the district. All of that work was then incorporated in the district's geographic information system, which you'll hear about in a moment, and then overlaid into the high resolution light detection and ranging data through a model for LiDAR for short. Sorry for the technical term. In terms of the elevations themselves, and following up on what Chair Lehman said at the beginning, many of the lakes in the district already have flood elevations attached to them that have been incorporated in area municipal official plans, zoning bylaws, or community planning permits. And those elevations came from provincial flood reduction mapping that was done in the 1980s and 1990s. So there already are elevations embedded in many planning documents in the district at the present time. So on this slide, we've compared the elevation developed through the most recent floodplain mapping against the existing elevations developed by the province quite a number of years ago. So on Lake Muskoka, for example, the new mapping indicates the elevation is 226.7, the existing elevation is 226.51. That's quite a small difference. Lake Joseph is very similar. Lake Rosso is also very similar. In fact, it's a little less. And then on Skeleton Lake, Peninsula Lake, Prairie Lake, and Verdon Lake, the differences are a little bit more significant in terms of the new elevations on those lakes, being much less than the existing elevations that were developed by the province years ago. I will note as well that on those lakes on the bottom, Skeleton Lake and down, the elevation did include a factor for wave uprush. And wave uprush is what happens during a major storm, a major flooding event and a storm where there's lots of wind. The waves rush up the shore beyond where the floodwaters are, and that's called wave uprush. So most of the area municipalities currently prohibit the development of new dwellings below, and in some cases above the flood elevation specified, meaning that the prohibitions we're talking about in the policies, which we'll get to, are not new and are generally being implemented today.
You're allowed to ask questions.
No, we're going to wait till the end.
Peter's the Pete. What's the badge file?
Oh, Peter.
What's Peter? Sorry, it's Peter.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. In area municipalities, with the two-zone mapping from Bridge and new dwellings are already permitted in the flood fringe provided only to a certain elevation. So to some extent, a lot of the policies that we're proposing to include in the district's plan are being implemented in one way or another in some, but not all of the local planning documents. At this point, I'm going to ask Ray to come up and put the overview of the mapping and how.
Good afternoon. I've been asked to do a quick overview of the Floodplain and LiDAR app that's found on the Scope Geo Hub site. And I'll take a shameless plug for the Scope Geo Hub web mapping site on this slide. We have 22 different apps that are available for the public to use, including historic weather photos, zoning maps, 40 years of water quality data, and the forest fire app, which shows all the active forest fires in Ontario right now. To date, those public maps have been opened 620,000 times. Part of that is the Floodline and LiDAR app, which we provide detailed floodline mapping for all of Muskoka. We also provide real-time or near real-time water level elevations for 9 major lakes in Muskoka. And that app has been opened 48,000 times, and it was first published on October 18th, 2020. And at that time, it included phase 1 floodline mapping for 17 lakes and rivers, including the Muskoka River and Lake Muskoka. Today, after phase 2 and 3, we now have 77 lakes, 19 rivers for a total of 96 RDOs, including Valley. We also have an internal version for all the district and Muskoka staff and all the staff in each of the area municipalities. We have a version internally for the Muskoka Geo Hub, which includes all of these floodline mapping layers, and those apps have been opened 300,000 times. In order to find us, there's 3 different ways. The preferred way would be going to the District of Muskoka website, www.muskoka.olo.ca. And when you're there, you see a whole bunch of other really interesting information about the Viral Hub. But you could search in the search bar for maps, take you to the page, and there you'll see this big red button, Launch GeoHub Now. So click that. And there's also some helpful videos there. You could also do a simple Google search, Muskoka GeoHub, it'll find us. Or you could use that URL at the bottom there, directly to the GeoHub of map.muskoka.org.ca. So when you get there, this is the default view. And I think you'll notice at the top, there's 4 different options. There's a 2D map, 3D map, there's a dashboard, and a hydrograph. And I'm going to be showing you today just the hydrographs for the 2D. The legend on the right, you'll be able to see that we've added at the top the live lake level lines, shown as a black line. More information on that in minutes. We also have added a symbol to show the location of the lake and river gauges. And we have 15 of those in the district of Muskoka, and those are measuring the elevation of the water. And we get that data directly from Environment Canada. The legend also has historically flooded roadways. So the district staff do our best to add a point on the map every time the road is closed, flooding. And today we've added 123 points to our map. So the floodline mapping legend has 5 different types of classifications of flooding. The lakes are the most largest or popular, I guess, and they have the static floodline elevation, and those are all shown in the purple hatch area. And they represent the projected worst possible flooding on each lake, and each lake is different based on the very detailed modeling did by the engineering consultants. They provided a very specific elevation for each lake, and using the high resolution LiDAR data, we generated this line over. They provided that data to the Muskoka GeoHub or the Muskoka GIS team, and all we did is we published it to make it available to the public through the Muskoka GeoHub. The rivers in Muskoka are different than the lakes, and the floodline map displays here are the floodway and the floodlines. We have also included in the legend classification for that 100-year flood elevation. But that's a very small area in Jordan Bay, etc. The last item that we've added to the legend is the horizontal wave allowance, which is added just for Lake Muskoka. If you click, when you go to this at home and click on it for the first time and click on one of those floodline mapping options, you're going to get this pop-up window. And this is going to show you a lot of information, including the one at the bottom, the link to those very technical reports that the engineering consulting group has provided us, which Nick has mentioned. You can also see the key map PDF files and the very detailed maps the consultants have provided us in that PDF set. It also provides you that very important static lake elevation value in these pop-ups. And again, every lake is different. And it also tells you what phase it was, phase 1, phase 2. So we've also taken the the lake gauge information from Environment Canada and created something fairly new called the lake level lines. These are updated and added to our Muskoka GeoHub, and these lines are updated every hour based on the information that we're getting from those lake gauges on those lines. And what you can see in this example, which I took during the height of the flooding this May, is the live lake level lines are very close to the static floodline elevation that the engineer had predicted. This is an example of a hydrograph. And what we're doing with the real-time data that we're getting from Environment Canada lake gauges is to record it and automatically plot it on these hydrographs. These hydrographs are layered over top of in our operating regions. The bottom right is the current conditions section, which gives you the water level updated every hour, and that is color coded to match which operating zone the level is in. We made one improvement to these hydrographs this year. We were able to add the maximum recorded lake elevation line at the top, which also indicates the date to which that occurred. So here's a scenario. Next months from now, years from now, whenever we've forgotten what happened with the flood, what you can do is go back in time and look at all the historical information associated to each one of these hydrographs. You pick which lake you're interested in, and you can actually see the historical lake level. If you go to the bottom, you can click on that little window, click, hold, and drag all the way to the left, which is taking you 20 years back, see every day in which that lake level was recorded. You can then use this information to confirm the maximum recorded lake level for each lake. And in this particular case, if I can just hover my mouse over top of these lines, it's dynamic, so you're going to get some pop-up windows. And that's going to tell me that it's 226.45 meters above sea level is the max recorded, And that happened on May 2nd, 2019. What we could do now is go to the 2D map. And I can open up the elevation profile tool. And I can click on the draw a line. And I'm actually going to draw a line of the map over top of static floodline elevations, over top of the live lake level lines. And it's going to give me a cross section using the high resolution LiDAR. And in this cross section, I can see exactly where that elevation is on the map. So I can turn off the trees. And then I'm just hovering my mouse over top of this cross section, and you can see that line moving on the map. So that tells me when I get to this magic number of highest recorded lake elevation on this lake, 2.6.45, that is right there, and it's extremely close to the static floodline elevation that the engineers have predicted would be the worst flooding in the lake. So you could do that in any lake. You could do that going back on any date, and you can see where that elevation is on the map each time. So this is the last map I'd like to show you. This is showing not only the current static floodline elevation, so that purple patch area that are all on all our maps, but it also compares to the town of Bracebridge flood elevation line that has been used for years, previously. And you can see the elevations are very similar, as Nick mentioned. 226.7 versus 226.49 meters above sea level. And in most cases, it's almost the thickness of the line of the map that shows the different two elevations or values. So that's what I plan to present for you today. And at the back of the room, if you have any questions, we can talk.
Thank you very much, Graham. I said this afternoon, I'll say it again. I do work across the province of Ontario, and the mapping the district has available for its residents is awesome. It's absolutely awesome. I'm also a mapping guy, and I think they've done a really good job at explaining flood hazard mapping and showing how it applies on a property by property basis. And I'm really proud of that. And I think Graham and the team should be applauded for the great work you guys have done. And, in fact, one of the reasons we're all here today with computers in the background is for folks to actually go and talk to people at the end of the session and see how your property shows up on this mapping and what you can do with it moving forward. So in terms of the policies that we've written to implement all of this, they are summarized on this page. And this was the initial floodplain policy approach that was presented to council at the public meeting. So again, this is a summary, and I've really hit on the main points, I think. Firstly, the policies would have prohibited the development of new primary buildings, and new primary buildings are houses, basically, within the flood hazard limit on all lakes and within the floodway of all other lakes and rivers in the district. And as I mentioned this afternoon, that's not a big deal in most cases because all municipalities require buildings to be step back a minimum of a certain distance from any waterfall. So in many cases, the flood elevation is between wherever you want to build or wherever you're permitted to build and the water in any case. However, we do understand, of course, that in some circumstances, the flooding area comes in behind areas that are already built and so on, and we recognize that. The policies would have permitted minor additions, reconstruction, and accessory buildings or alterations to existing buildings on all lakes and rivers subject to criteria. So if you have an existing building, you can certainly continue using that building, and you can expand that building and develop accessory buildings on that property as well, provided all of what is happening is minor. And we've deliberately not identified what minor means in the context of the policies, and we do expect each local municipality to determine what is minor, what is appropriate for that municipality. With respect to permitting new primary buildings, the policies permit reconstruction buildings, as I mentioned, minor additions or alterations, and new accessory buildings in the floodplain. That's the floodplain part of the two-zone concept. Fourthly, with respect to the mapping itself, We think the mapping is awesome, but not everyone may agree. And what typically has happened in the last number of years is that whenever there's a discussion about where you can build on a property, a surveyor gets hired. And the surveyor figures out what the elevations are on a particular property and draws a line that is very unique to that property that reflects the elevation that's set out on the document that you're working on. So of course, that can continue to happen. And any information that is as detailed as that will obviously supersede the mapping that we're including within the official plan because it gives no detail and it gives you the information you need. So that's obviously still available to people to figure out. Physically, in terms of access, there are provincial policies on access that we have to consider and take into account. The policies require that safe access be demonstrated for any portion of driveway or right-of-way used to access residential development. But that only applies to when you're creating a new lot that may be accessed by a road or driveway that could be flooded, or a vacant lot that doesn't apply to lots that already have development on them. With respect to water access only lots, this is really a best practice policy, requires that safe access by foot be demonstrated if there is any redevelopment or rebuilding on the property. And of course, boathouses are a thing in Muskoka and they will always be, and we will continue to obviously permit boathouses, but again, subject to criteria in terms of their development. So in terms of the public response, the policies that we presented, there were some support and some in opposition. Of course, the ones in opposition outpaced the ones in support. However, we did get some comments and support. Few folks said that the updated mapping and policies will improve flood risk management and decision making. Others said clear, consistent policies across the district will help protect people, property, and the environment. And then others said that, recognizing that floodplain development increases risk for our community. I think we've seen insurance costs going through the roof in parts of the district, and that's an example of that, including higher costs, environmental impacts, and emergency response needs. So there was some support for the initiative being undertaken. With respect to comments in opposition, a lot of folks were really concerned about the Muskoka River water management plan and basically believe that the watershed is being mismanaged. So we heard lots and lots and lots about that. We appreciate those comments. I've already talked about that and indicated that the district has gone on record multiple occasions to try to get the province to look at reviewing that plan. Having said that, the work that's been done to date by the district has basically concluded that changes to that plan may not result in meaningful changes to the degree and extent of flooding in the district going forward. Maybe localized improvements, I get that, but in terms of meaningful changes, we don't think there will be. Others have said that we shouldn't be proceeding until that management plan is reviewed and improved in accordance with their thoughts and thinking. As I mentioned, we have no idea when that plan is going to be updated. We don't know when that's going to happen and how that's going to occur. The proposed framework would reduce development rights for some vacant properties. And it is true that the way the mapping was done, there are some properties that were not caught before that are caught now by the proposed mapping just by virtue of where they are. Many of the properties that were affected were along the Muskoka River where it enters into Lake Muskoka. And that is because historically the Muskoka River was subject to a two-zone approach almost to the mouth of the river where it entered into Lake Muskoka. And within that two-zone approach, as I mentioned earlier, you had an area you couldn't do anything, but then you had an area on the edge where you could build something provided you met certain criteria. So when the engineers retained by the district did their work, they moved that one zone, two zone line further inland along the river and basically created one zone where that two zone was. And within the one zone, this sounds very technical, you're not allowed to do as much development as you would have been permitted to do previously under the two zone approach. The simple explanation I got for all of that is that as Lake Muskoka floods and raises, there is the potential for the water to start backfilling or backwatering down the Muskoka River. And that's why they, out of abundance of caution, changed the way the floodline mapping moved in that, or worked in that area. We have an idea to address that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And then other folks said that the policies for Lake Muskoka and Georgian Bay are considered too restrictive. And as I mentioned, essentially, we were applying the same policies to all lakes and rivers in a similar manner in the district, even though the policies of the provincial planning statement do provide more flexibility on Lake Muskoka and Georgian Bay. So in terms of revisions that we made to the policy framework as they relate to Lake Muskoka and Georgian Bay, on Georgian Bay itself, the flood limit line is not really delineated in its entirety on the schedule, and therefore policy is being added to enable an assessment to determine the location of the 100-year flood, plus an appropriate allowance for wave effects in this scenario. There already is an elevation that's being applied to Georgian Bay. It's been the same for quite a number of years, 178, I believe. And essentially, this policy allows for site-specific assessment to figure out where that line is on a property-by-property basis, and then you can what you can do. Secondly, instead of prohibiting the development of new primary buildings within the flood hazard limit of Lake Muskoka and Georgian Bay, it is proposed that new primary buildings on vacant lots, on existing vacant lots, may be considered provided certain criteria are met. So that's a change. And that has a direct impact on those lots that are affected along Lake Muskoka, along Muskoka River, where it enters into Lake Muskoka. Some of the criteria are an alternative location. You have to do floodproofing, access policies are met, doesn't make the hazard worse, and no other impacts as a consequence. And these changes recognize that provincial policy is less restrictive on Georgian Bay and Lake Muskoka simply because they are larger lakes. The prohibition on new primary buildings, homes within the floodway on all other lakes and rivers would remain as required by provincial policy. So that has not changed. We do not have a choice with respect to that. That is directly from the province and is something we are required to implement. So in summary, the floodplain map was completed by qualified personnel and in accordance with federal, provincial guidelines and requirements. It is the best available information that we have on where flooding may occur in the future. We acknowledge, however, that if new information comes forward, if the water management plan is updated, if that, then of course we would change our mapping approach. Probably wouldn't be changing the policy approach as much because the policies are basically given to us by the province, but they go with the mapping. So if there is new information, then that mapping will be updated as required. In our view, the proposed policies strike a balance between protecting public health and safety while recognizing historic development patterns. There are thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of buildings and structures that are within flood elevation now in the district. All of them are recognized. All of them can be rebuilt. Additions are possible. And reconstruction is also possible as well. So, and then lastly, the policies also establish a consistent and transparent approach to floodplain management across the entire district, which was one of the initial recommendations made by the Muskoka Watershed Advisory Group. So in terms of next steps, we are proposing to bring the official plan back to the committee and council for consideration this fall. Council then has to decide on how to proceed. We're recommenders, we're not decision makers. We do the best we can, and we do the job we're supposed to do. We provide council with recommendations, and then they make the decision. And at this meeting, a staff report that summarizes all of the comments that have been made, and we've got lots and lots of comments. We've got all of them, and they're all summarized, and they will all be addressed in a table attached to the staff report. So you'll see where your comments were, how they were considered, and what changes we made, if there were any, as a consequence. And if the district council adopts the amendment, it will then be forwarded off to the province for approval, and then they will need to make a decision when they make a decision. In terms of moving forward and how to stay informed, You can subscribe to the Muskoka Official Plan Review Engage page, and you can scan the QR code on this slide. If you want to be notified of the decision of the district, you must make a written request to the district clerk. All of the folks that have submitted written comments are already on mailing list, and you will already receive notice. So if you want to do this more formally, please do so, and you can do that.